Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day. Welcome to the third webinar in a four-part series presented by American Jewish Committee and Tablet Magazine titled 21st Century Europe and the Jews. Over these four programs, AJC and Tablet are exploring timely issues related to Jewish life and the protection of democracies in Europe. Today's program will address the nuances of French society and the challenges it faces in a changing world. Joining us today are writer and filmmaker Caroline Forrest, Senior Director of the Europe Center at the Atlantic Council Benjamin Haddad, renowned philosopher and journalist Bernard-Henri Levy, and journalist and novelist Mark Weitzman. Moderating today's program is AJC Europe Managing Director Simone Rodin Benzaken. After we hear from our guests, time permitting, we will take your questions. You may submit your questions through the Q&A feature in Zoom. Simone, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Hello to your audience, to the audience. Hello to our panelists. Over the past 20 years, France has seen the rise of anti-Semitism and Islamism, but also the rise of populism, both from the left and the right in its country, all of which have really tested the strength of France's Republican model. As we are slowly, or not so slowly, entering a probable fifth wave of COVID, and more important, a presidential campaign in France, we're seeing all of these issues reveal themselves once again in quite a virulent manner. To talk about where France is and where it is going, I'm particularly pleased to welcome some of the most brilliant minds France has to offer to the world, all of whom I have the privilege of calling my friends. Bonjour tout le monde.
Bonjour.
Bonjour. So to start out, I have a very, very little demand to all of you. I would like to ask you to keep your answers as short as possible. We are numerous today, and French intellectuals are not particularly renowned for using few words. So in order to cover as much ground as possible and dig as deep as possible, it's, I think, an important request. So I'll dig right in, and I'll start out with you, Mark. And I start out specifically to ask you a question about anti-Semitism in France. A few days ago, the murderer of Mireille Knoll, and for those of you who don't know, a quick reminder, Mireille Knoll was a 85-year-old Holocaust survivor who had been stabbed and burned in her Paris apartment. The murderer has been sentenced to a long prison sentence. During the trial, the murderer mentioned the terrorist Mohamed Merah, who had previously killed in 2012 3 Jewish school children and a teacher, but also Hitler's Mein Kampf. Mark, you followed this and other trials closely and have written extensively about the issue of anti-Semitism, including in your really excellent book. And if the audience hasn't read it, I would recommend it, called Hate. And so how would you define today's anti-Semitism in France?
In 5 minutes?
Yes.
In a nutshell, the wave of anti-Semitism started in France. The violent wave started in the aftermath of the failure of the Oslo process in 9/11. That's when there was a surge of spontaneous act of violence, variously graded from stoning synagogues to the first murder of a Jew in 2003. Those incidents were not planned. It's the most interesting aspect of them. They were mainly the fact of Muslim citizens, and their characteristic. They were a surge of spontaneous rage directed against Jewish people that could be attacked in the street, or suddenly someone would turn toward his or her neighbor in an eruption of rage. This lasted, in a nutshell, until 2012, when Mohamed Merah's killing in Toulouse suddenly made people realize that there was something beyond that spontaneous rage that could be exploited politically, and that there was a narrative. In a nutshell, the Mohammed Merah provided the frame that would help to articulate the blind, unspoken rage against the Jews that had been the case until then. Then this rage, from 2015 on, this rage changed into a planned terror wave that was directed against everybody, not just the Jews, even though Jewish attacks served as a process of legitimizing violence against everyone else, as we've seen, for instance, of the Charlie Hebdo attack that went with the Hyperkosher in Vincennes, etc. So you had what appeared at that moment in 2015 was what became clear was that hatred against Jews, violent hatred against the Jews, served as a vocabulary for hate directed against French in general. That was one thing. The other thing that became apparent in 2014, just one year before the terror wave, was the rise of a populist rhetoric of the extreme right that borrowed anti-Semitic tropes that had been unheard of since the 30s. And this is the junction of those two currents that provided the specific atmosphere that we're in now, with the additional ironies of having a Jew resurrecting the anti-Semitic rhetoric of the 30s, the fascist rhetoric of the 30s.
You mean specifically, because
I mean specifically Eric Zemmour, of course. So how do we explain this conjunction of a spontaneous rage evolving into a planned terror attack fueled by anti-Semitism on the one hand, and the apparent resurrection of an old French trope, anti-democratic, anti-republican, and anti-Semitic, that dates back to the first half of the 20th century. We'll come back to that probably later on in the discussion, but in a nutshell, my intuition is that the Islamist terrorists provide a sort of unavowed model for the far right today, as we've seen explicitly with Eric Zemmour, who goes as far as claiming his admiration for the Kouachi brothers, for instance. Somewhere along the way, the surge of armed violence began to fascinate far right rhetoricians in this country for complex reasons, because for a long time, extremists on both sides, far right and far left, were seen as defined themselves as the losing side. Everybody thought that in Europe, action and words were dissociated with the other. You could argue that you wanted great causes to fight for, you wanted to die for the nation, for patriotism and so forth, against immigration or for the revolution. But basically you couldn't do anything. It was over. History was behind us. And suddenly what happened was that Islamists showed that in fact, you could actually act accordingly to what you thought. You could actually make the words active and kill according to your beliefs. And I think that really, Eric Zemmour said explicitly that he had an admiration for the Kouachi brothers because they were able to do things that we Westerners, being feminized, were not able to do any longer. We were too weak. We were like women, which is exactly the rhetoric of the Islamists, of course. When you look at what the Islamists used to say in the 90s in Algeria, they said exactly that. They said that they were defending the Islamist society and real Islam against what they called the democracy of homosexuals brought by Westerners and international Jewry to destroy Muslim manhood. So there's a parallel between the rhetoric of someone like Zemmour and the rhetoric of the Islamists. And so, and of course, the Jews, ironically enough, end up being the target of both, but we'll come back to that. I'll stop there because I'm a nice boy and I respect the time.
Thank you very much, Mark, for being a nice boy. Caroline, let me follow up here. First of all, if you want to react to what Mark just mentioned, but he specifically mentioned this sort of conjunction. And you personally have been committed in fighting all sorts of fundamentalism for years, for decades, really, despite your young age. Now, it's sort of odd because, it sort of seems that over the past years, the moderate voices are fewer and sort of more powerless, and Islamist seems to get stronger, and the populists or the far right is getting stronger. Do you feel that's accurate? And where do you think we stand today, and what can be done? And also finally, what impact do you see the current state of affairs, basically what Mark just described, if you agree with that, have an impact on the presidential campaign that we will be having in a few months?
Yes, thank you, Simon. It's actually, yes, quite suffocating as a climate, because we have the feeling that once we are fighting against an extreme, the other one is winning and the other one is growing. But for those who are listening and are not from France, and I just want to put it at the right scale, I would say that we are still a country where anti-Semitism is absolutely rejected by the huge majority of the country, and it's the ultimate taboo for us. It's actually where we can see where a problem is starting. When totalitarianism is starting, we have this tradition to know that it's always start by targeting the Jews. So for years, it was the whole country who really, for years after the work on the memory about the Holocaust, I would say that for years we thought that this kind of racism was probably one of the racism that was behind us. We started to see the change, and a big change, first in terms of propaganda, before, of course, the physical attacks and the terrorist attacks. I would say it started in the 90s, after the Gulf War, where when the Islamist propaganda started to grow, after the 9/11, after the second Intifada for sure, it became more physical. And we saw that the result of this propaganda, and again, I insist, because it didn't came from nowhere. It came from a very strategic, organized propaganda spread by a specific network, a specific Islamic network, the Muslim Brotherhood. And they're very, very smart to convince the youth that they need to be more Muslim, and to radicalize them in a way where they're not only becoming more religious, they also are becoming more anti-Semitic, more homophobic, and more sexist. And this is the problem we have today with a part of our youngs, of our youth, that is becoming more religious and more racist in the same time. And for years, we have been in denial, because it was growing. This type of racism, this type of new anti-Semitism, I would say, was growing inside a minority that herself could be targeted, could be victim of racism, the Muslim community. So for us, it was, as it is everywhere, was quite not comfortable to tackle this, to look at it. And we lost time, I must say. We lost really years, because it was growing inside a minority. And now we have another problem. So now I would say that the debate is finally including sometimes maybe too much about those issues. Sometimes we are speaking too much about it, but we speak day and night about the fact that, yes, we have a problem with our youth that is becoming radical, that is becoming intolerant, that is becoming violent. And it's true, and it's a problem. But then we are in denial of the fact that the new anti-Semitism is not only coming from the minority, it's also coming back from the opposite, the other extreme, the more classical extreme, I would say, the far right. And we saw that during the Yellow Vest protest. So it was popular demonstration for all kinds of reasons, But inside, we started to see also anti-Semitic slogan. We saw that also during the protests against vaccination, against the sanitary pass, and the fuel, how it has been fueled there, it's the Russian propaganda, the conspiracy theories growing at a huge scale and at the scale of being not really under control because of the social networks. So now we are exactly in the middle. We are suffocating because we have anti-Semitism coming from minority and anti-Semitism coming from paranoiac, extreme right. And we have worse than that because, as Mark mentioned, we have even during this presidential campaign, a candidate of the far right that is probably the candidate of these 8, surrounded by the old extreme right, the old Catholic extreme right, the most anti-Semitic Catholic extreme right we never saw that for years. I mean, those are unbelievable around him, and it's Eric Zemmour. And himself is Jew. And it's also because there is this taboo in France, you cannot be officially anti-Semitic. The only one who can be inside a presidential campaign and carry those dark feelings and carry this hate, I think it can be only someone named Eric Zemmour. But then we are trapped because we have the difficulty of being, again, trying to defend some very balanced idea and trying to fight against the racism of someone named Eric Zemmour. So he's racist against Muslims, and behind him there is racist against Jew, and still is convincing some Jew to be against the Muslims. And on the opposite side, we have Muslims that have been convinced by the extreme to be against the Jew. And Simon, if I can finish on that, we have even more than that. I'm sorry if I'm losing anyone, but we are dealing with it every day. We have more than that. We have including extremist movements that are doing both. I will mention one name, named Alain Soral, is unfortunately very famous here for his video full of hate and very popular amongst, again, the youth. And this one is coming from the far right. He's a racist white guy, very old guy, kind of racist guy, but he's trying to convince the youth of the suburbs, the Muslim youth, that they should be united against the Jew. He called it the face alliance, the alliance of the Islamists and the nationalists. So we are dealing with all of this, and still I'm confident that we can defeat all of them.
Praise your confidence. Bernard, so we spoke about Eric Zemmour in the campaign, or he's not even a declared candidate, just for your audience to know. We've been speaking about him for weeks and weeks and weeks, but he's not even officially a candidate. You've had let's say, a pretty public dispute with Eric Zemmour recently. Bernard, how do you explain his success, and how does the fact that he is Jewish have a significance in the campaign? And more specifically, also, how does his discourse about history, about the nation, about he frames citizenship, what does it mean for society as a whole and for Jews in particular?
First of all, I did not have a dispute. He insulted me in a very grave way, which is very different. He named me a traitor. He went on TV after a column which I did in a weekly magazine, and he denounced me, he designated me as a traitor to France. This is not a dispute. It is a candidate showing me as the embodiment of betrayal of our common country. It's much more, much less on my side and much more on his side than a dispute. Relationship of Zemmour to history, what effect it has on all the topics we are discussing now, it has two simple effects. Number one, the way in which Zemmour considers history operates as a magnet for all the current anti-Semitisms. A man and a Jew who says, number one, that Alfred Dreyfus might have been sort of guilty. A man who says that Marshal Pétain and the regime of Vichy sort of protected the Jews. And a man who says that a child from Toulouse cannot be at the same time French and buried in Israel, this man gives
let me just specify this for the audience. I'm just going to explain it. So that was the children who were killed by
the victims of Mohamed Merah, the terrorist of Toulouse. Her family decided to bury them in Jerusalem after their martyrdom, and Emir Zemmour wrote a very terrible page comparing them to their killer, to Mohamed Merah, because the family of Mohamed Merah wanted to bury him in Algeria. And he said, at the end of the day, it is the same. The killer and the little angels killed by the killer have the same destiny, and they are equally stranger to France. So this, again, gave an argument, gave a fuel to an old fantasy of all anti-Semites of the left and of the right, which is the theory of the double allegiance. You cannot be French and loving and lover of Israel. You have to choose between France or Israel. And if you go to be buried in Israel, you're not a true French. So, which is, by the way, a stupidity. We have in the French history so many heroes, characters of history, knights of the Crusades who were buried, by the way, in Jerusalem, far from France, and who are still French, that it is, on top of everything, totally stupid. And Zemmour is not an historian, and he's not as learned as some commentators think. So, effect number one, by reviving all of these topics of the anti-Semitism and by giving them the brand of a Jewish name and of a Jewish identity, of course, he reinforces them to a great extent. Number two, he is doing a second thing. Eric Zemmour is constantly saying on TV shows, in his arguments with journalists, he's constantly quoting a famous quote from the French Revolution of MP of this time, saying that the Republic has to give everything to the Jews as individuals and nothing as a nation. And he's pleading by this quote, by this reference to French Revolution, for a sort of close to zero and minimal. By doing so, he operates a huge way back, a huge retreat from what the French Jews achieved since 30 or 40 years, which was precisely to be good citizens, good patriots, and committed Jews. My generation and the following generation, and all the young French Jews whom I know today in France, they do that very easily, to be really lovers of the flag, faithful to their nation, and committed to Jewish study, to Jewish memory, to whatever. And Eric Zemmour, by his way of taking position on this debate, makes this impossible. So the few Jews who follow him go back in this sense to the way of being a Jew which prevailed in the dark ages of French Jewry, which is the 30s, or even before the time of the Dreyfus affair, when you had to make the other people forget that you were a Jew, that to be a Jew was a sort of a shameful part of your identity which you had to hide. And one of the progress which the French Jewry accomplished was to get out of this trap. This being said, I am not so pessimistic, and maybe it might be one of a point of discussion between my friends and myself. I think that the Zemmour phenomenon is not so important. I think that the balloon will rather soon deflate. I think that there is less and less Jews who fall in the trap and who buy this corrupted merchandise. I really believe that. And by the way, if I can add a little grain of pepper to our discussion, I'm happy to discuss about anti-Semitism. But in general, my way of thinking has always been, since 40 years, that anti-Semitism is not such an important question. It is the problem of the anti-Semite, of course. The question is not to theorize too much, to identify them too accurately. It is to combat them. My way of acting since my beginnings has been that the real question raised by anti-Semitism is not how to define them. This I did long time ago. In 1981, I wrote a piece saying that the new form of anti-Semitism was hate of Israel. It was the narrative which allowed to magnetize again all the other narratives. But I said that I think that the real question is how to combat it, how to fight against him, how to win. The real question is how to win against the anti-Semite. And on this point, I agree with Caroline. I think that for the moment, under our institutions, our political class, President Macron saying in a dinner of the CRIF 1.5 years ago that anti-Zionism was the last possible way of being anti-Semite. By doing all that, France is resisting not so badly to the growing black wave, or brown red, which is black at the end of the day.
Thank you, Bernard. And maybe afterwards, after the question, I'll ask Benjamin, maybe others, you can react to each other. But Benjamin, I also want to give you the possibility of reacting maybe to what has said already. But more specifically, you're French, you've lived in the United States for quite a while now, observing, of course, your home country from afar. And last year, you were amongst the very few voices to explain what the issue of Islamist separatism was and the need to address it, as President Macron did following Professor Samuel Paty's murder. So my question to you is, do you feel that there is now a better understanding in the United States of the danger of Islamism represented in France and in Europe? And do you think generally that there is a good understanding in the United States of the issues that France is facing?
Thanks, Simone, and it's really great to be here. Well, look, it's been a very difficult issue to explain, I think, in the United States, to a large extent because it's been hijacked by domestic, ideological and cultural American debates that have not much to do with France, unfortunately, even though some of them are being imported in France. So, sometimes when the American media covers France, it's talking about the US and it's talking about the American media and the American intellectual debates rather than talking about France. So it's a little bit of a dialogue de sourds, as the French would say. It's hard to be really understood. But look, we have a lot of allies. We have a lot of people who understand. I think what I was trying to explain at the time on this question of Islamist separatism is that, Macron and the people supporting him in this endeavor were not running after the far right. On the contrary. And this is also why I share Bernard's conclusion. I am optimistic about France, and I am optimistic about our ability to win this fight, because I think there is in the center in France, among Republicans and liberals, we have the intellectual and ideological tools to fight this fight and to fight both Islamism and the far right with the same tool, with the tools of Republican universalism, without falling into essentialism, without falling into ultranationalism or the trap of identity. And I think this is precisely what Macron was trying to do. When you listen to his speech, he was always very careful to distinguish between radical Islamism and Islam, and people wanting to observe and live their religion peacefully. What the law at the time was trying to do is, in France, we've had a series of terror attacks. As Marc, Caroline, and Bernard said, Jews were the canary in the coal mine. Started with anti-Semitic attacks, and then it spread to the rest of the population, as it always does. But in a way, the security issue, the terrorist issue, is the emerged part of the iceberg. It hides a broader ideological battle, which is what the term separatism meant to cover, which is that neighborhoods are falling prey to radical groups that are where authorities, where the education system, where the police are having a harder and harder time penetrate, at the expense, of course, of women, at the expense of gays, at the expense of Jews, at the expense of anyone who wants to live just a normal life. And so this is what this bill was intended to do, is to sort of break these ideological ecosystems. And also, first, because it's a question of protecting the people who live in these territories, but also because when it meets someone who wants to act violently, sometimes for psychological reasons, then it spreads into violent acts. But the violent acts are a consequence of this, and there's a much deeper phenomenon. And so that's, it's going to be a generational battle. But I think the real challenge for all of us is to understand that the solution is not to fall to the far right and to nationalism. And here you have the real difference. And I think in this respect, I am worried about Eric Zemmour. I think we will beat him. I think people are starting now to realize what he's saying, what he's been writing. A lot of us are reading his books to understand. But there is a true difference. And by the way, I want to, because we're speaking to an American audience, and of course, we're already seeing a lot of articles about the comparison with Trump. So if you allow me, I want to say a quick word about this, because sure. There is, of course, an element of comparison, and he's been very good at shaping the media debate. He launches a grenade in the debate, everyone is reacting, it's feeding the bubble. He's a journalist, he's a TV star, so he's very astute at this. But one thing that's really important to me is that I hate when people use the term populist. He's not a populist, whatever that means. He's a far-right nationalist in a tradition, as Marc said very well, in tradition coming back to the 1930s, the Action Française. There's a very strong ideological current and political movement. It's a far-right anti-Republican and anti-democratic movement. He's very open about this, to his credit. He quotes Maurras, Barrès, Bainville, all the anti-Semitic intellectuals of this generation. And there's a real intellectual project, and Bernard spoke about his use of history. I think that's really important. Zemmour is controversial for saying that, Pétain, for rehabilitating Pétain and Vichy, and for saying that Pétain protected French Jews at the expense of foreign Jews. And so there was still a national project and French Jews were protected. This is untrue. Every historian in the last 30, 40 years that has had access to the archives know that not only is it not true, it's even worse than that. Pétain and Vichy made it worse for French Jews. They worsened, they went further than what the Nazis were asking. So why is he saying this? What's the project here? The project is to rid the French of the guilt, of the shame of collaboration with the Nazis and of Vichy, and to say there is nothing wrong with nationalism. There is nothing wrong with what you did in the Second World War. You have this stain of collaboration and sending Jews and Jewish kids to the camps, but that's just left-wing, self-hating ideology. So forget about this. And now you can reconcile with nationalism to fight the real threat, which is Islam. Not Islamism, by the way. He's very clear, Zemmour, he always says Islam. So there is a project. Pétain and Vichy is not just an anecdote in his thinking. It's not something he's saying to be provocative. It's at the core of his worldview. And this, by the way, is why I think we will win, because we don't need far-right nationalism, anti-democratic or liberal nationalism to win the struggle, because we have the tools with republicanism, with laïcité, with the universal French ideas to be able to win this fight. And this is, I think, what we're seeing. And there's been, it's been long, and Caroline said it, it's taken a long time for the French elite, especially, to be awakened to these issues. But I think we're there. There's been there's a huge difference in the French debate today than there was maybe 10, 15 years ago, when the three other people that you have on the screen were already raising the alarm. But I think now a lot of people are getting much closer to this.
I can't believe I'm actually speaking to French intellectuals, given the extent to which you are actually all pretty optimists. It's more of an American thing. But in any case, it's a pleasure to see. I know that Mark actually wanted to react, and then I have a question for Caroline. Mark, I think you wanted to react to something that has been said before.
Yeah, a few things. First of all, yeah, I agree with Bernard that Zemmour will blow up at some point. I'm not worried at all, as you say, as you know, about Zemmour's future. I don't think he'll make it at all. I'm not even sure he'll actually run for the presidency at all. Part of the fascination he exerts comes from the press, comes from the fact that he's a journalist, and for some reason, journalists can't help being fascinated by someone who's coming from them, from their environment. It's a corporatist enthusiasm to some extent. At least it started that way. Another part of the fascination he exerts is the fact that he's resurrecting what I would call, as in the line of the Hofstadter, the French paranoid style. That has been said, was so pervasive in the first half of the 20th century. French is a very strange country. It's a very brutal country. When you go back to the first decades of the 20th century, it's a country that suffered from the first wave of terrorism in a Western country at the end of the 19th century. It's the place where the Protocol of the Elders of Zion was written, and the Russian agents who wrote it always said that they were inspired by the specific atmosphere of Paris at the time. So there's this whole mythopoetic of hatred, if you will, that comes back now, and which is the real thing for me. I mean, why does it come back now? I think it has to do with the end of the two narratives that shaped the political identity of the country during the whole Cold War. Gaullism and socialism simply became obsolete in the 90s, and it left room for disillusion and the return of the ghost of the past that were just waiting for someone to shape a new narrative. And again, that's what the Islamists on the one hand and the far right on the other hand have achieved so far. Their efficiency remains to be seen. But I wanted to react to, I finished on this, on the notion that that is natural for the Jews, for the French Jews, to be both Jewish and patriots. I'm not so sure actually about this. I think that somewhere in the 20th century, something was broken. The symbiosis between Jews and French was broken because of that climate of violence that culminated with the Vichy regime. Since then, there's been a slight uneasiness among Jews. There's a reason why Zemmour is backed or finds supporters among Sephardic Algerian religious Jews, the same way that Pétain was supported paradoxically by assimilated Jews in 1940. This was never, it seems to me that the real issue here is not so much laïcité, it is assimilation. There is a problem with assimilation in France. It's been a long story, and the Jews have somewhat dealt with that issue more or less in silence so far. And now it's here. It's here among the Muslims, and I would say it's here among the Jews. And somehow, in a way, Zemmour is somewhat embodying that issue in a pathological way, it seems to me. So I think it's perhaps I don't know. It seems to me that we miss a point when we think that by fighting, by arguing republicanism and laicite and so forth, we will deal definitely with the issue. I think we're forgetting, by saying so, we're forgetting that we're living in a country where the political class is in shambles. The whole frame of the political culture is gone. and Macron and Zemmour are the product of that destruction. It leaves a lot of room for a lot of unexpected things. I'm not worried about Zemmour himself, but what he's paving the way for, the atmosphere he's creating, and what's going to happen in the next 5 years remains to be seen.
Thank you, Mark. I have one last question. I'm sorry, unless someone wants to react to what Mark just mentioned. I have one last question because I think it's an important issue that that has not yet entirely been addressed, even though Benjamin sort of spoke about it. But Caroline, you had numerous debates. It feels now years ago, but it wasn't so long ago. Disagreement with American journalists on the topic of Islamic separatism, on the topic of laicity, or on the topic of whether who's responsible for the growth of Islamism and terrorism in France. And I wanted to ask you, in the conversations that you've had over the past year, what do you feel that Americans don't get about this, and about France, about laicity, and how can it be rectified?
Thank you, Simon. I still have hope that we can rectify a lot of those misunderstandings. As Benjamin said, I think one of the major problems is that the American journalists are absolutely not interested, let's be specified, of the New York Times, of the Washington Post mostly, not only, but mostly, are not interested in speaking about the complexity of what is going on in France. They are wearing American glasses and they try to connect what is going on with the American actuality. And sometimes it's just the opposite. For example, in the US, the main major physical threat is the white supremacist terrorism. I mean, most of the last attacks are coming from white supremacist extremists. And we are living the contrary. We are living in a climate where we are having terrorist attacks almost every 3 months. And it's always 90% of the time, it's starting to change, but 90% of the time it's coming from an Islamist extremist, killing Jewish children, killing people who are listening to music. And of course, we know that after years of this, it is impossible to not have a strong, angry reaction in front of it. And we are many to think that the best protection to avoid hate as a response to the terrorist attacks and the fundamentalism that we are facing is the shield of secularism and universalism. It's actually, and this is where I disagree with Mark, it's actually something that is protecting us from hate speech, from racism as an answer, as a response to fanatism, the Islamic fanatism. And at the same time, where we are building this shield to avoid the temptation of the extreme right and racism, we have been accused of being ourselves racist just because, again, as a legitimate defense, the French government decided to tackle the ideological fight, to tackle the fanatic ideology behind those terrorist attacks. If you compare to the American situation, it would have been if the US have been under terrorist attack every 3 months coming from white supremacists, and at the minute, or let's say Joe Biden is trying to say, we are going to do something about white supremacism, white supremacist ideology, he would have been accused of being whitophobic. And we have been accused of being Islamophobic just because we decided to regulate hate speech and fanatic propaganda coming from very radical group that we know, and it's never written in the American press, that we know that they are anti-Jew, anti-gay, very sexist, very homophobic, and that they are radicalizing the youth. And this is the source of the misunderstanding because, again, we also have racist problems. We see that with Eric Zemmour, that is clearly someone spreading the hate against the Muslims. But it has been confused for years, and this is why it's working also. Eric Zemmour can appear as someone who is just defending the country, because the accusation of being racist has been so badly used to target only secularists, only feminists, that now the word in itself is losing any sense. And there is one word in the middle of this cultural battle that is really, really a trap. And it is the word Islamophobia. Because Islamophobia means that if you are just critical about Islamism, critical about fanatism, you can be accused of being Islamophobic, like if you are racist against Muslims. And it's two separate things. There is people who are racist against Muslims. It is the case of Eric Zemmour. It is the case of the far right. And we are fighting against them. If you are confusing them with the secularists and the feminists who are just trying to resist, again, because they are attacked, against fundamentalism, including if it is a Muslim fundamentalism, then we are confusing everything, and we are helping the fanatics to help the racists to grow together. And we are in this infernal circle, trapped into it. And we need so much to have colleagues from the US to try to understand the complexity of this context, to stop confusing again secularist and racist because of this word Islamophobia. If they are using the right word, which is racist, they will see the difference. They will see that it is absolutely not the same to attack fundamentalism and to target the Muslims. It's two separate things. And again, when we are trying to resist to Islamic fundamentalism, it's because we are trying to resist to racism. Racism against Jew, racism against gay, racism against women. I'm using racism to say hate, you understand me. I hope those misunderstandings can be finally disappear. They can disappear because really we need to be ally on that. We are used to be ally against totalitarianism. And when the totalitarianism is coming from a minority, we are losing our American allies. And we need them so much. And they need also to see that inside the US, there is the same problem. Anti-Semitism is growing also inside minorities. And it's not because it is inside minorities that it is not racism and hate. It is.
Thank you, Caroline. I would have loved to continue the conversation with you, but I don't want to, I want to allow the audience and to ask you questions as well. So I'm stepping out of the picture now and giving the mic back to Claire.
Thank you, Simone. Our first question comes from AJC CEO David Harris, who thanks the panelists for this superb conversation. Could the panelists comment on the role of social media in disseminating hate, including anti-Semitism, and the differences between France and the US about both corporate social responsibility and the American notion of the First Amendment? And perhaps Benjamin, we'll start with you.
Sure. Well, a quick word. I mean, clearly there's a different interpretation here because France, like other European countries, has some laws restricting hate speech, Holocaust, denialism, whereas, of course, in the United States, you have the First Amendment that makes freedom of speech sacrosanct and makes it much harder to tackle and regulate social media platforms. We've seen this debate. You know, it was really interesting to see the way Europeans reacted to social media platforms when they deplatformed Donald Trump after January 6th, because in the United States, there's this expectation that private companies will regulate themselves. Whereas in Europe, which is pushing an agenda that's much tougher on social media platforms, this decision to deplatform Donald Trump was actually poorly received because it was saying, look, these platforms, even though they're private companies and they have the legal right to do this, they have a responsibility because of the impact and the way they have on the public conversation. And so you can't just let them, decide on their own to do this. Of course, these social media platforms have played a critical role in the spread of conspiracy theories in the last few years. And, we're talking about radicalism and anti-Semitism. We could talk about vaccines and COVID, of course, just, even more current. So I think it's a really important conversation to have. And here, the French and the EU have been pushing a lot on content removal, on trying to work with the platforms. And it's really important, I think, to have the United States on board in this debate.
Benjamin, I really thought when Donald Trump was deplatformed, I really thought that it was not the job and the responsibility of Mark Zuckerberg to decide what was right and wrong for an entire nation and for the world. Therefore, because of that, I think that the French model, which laws defining the circle of the words which can be safely exchanged in a public area, is better than the American model. This Donald Trump story, the fact that we saw with astonishment a private company directed by a young guy who has some qualities for sure, Zuckerberg, doing this job, was the proof that there was something wrong in the American pattern and something maybe to be thought about in the French pattern. I would like to add something to what Caroline said also. Caroline said that the American press, in particular New York Times and Washington Post, and others, of course, did not get the complexity of the French situation. The real problem is that they don't get the complexity of the American situation too. This is the real point. They don't get the point that the hate speech comes today from the left as much as from the right. They don't make the point that also in America, you have some Islamist terrorism. As far as I know, the two World Trade Center attacks, the first one in the 90s and September 11, they were not white supremacists. So the problem with the American press is that they really don't want to catch the real complexity and even the darkness in which the two sides of the political spectrum in America are diving in. And this is what concerns me. And I say it from a place, Tablet, which is, thanks God, one of the places which is resisting to this double bind and to this jaw, which is trying to trap not us French, but you, Americans, in this double terrible constraint. So this is a real problem in America, not only for France. And about what Mark said, again, I agree with all of that, but this debate has a sense if each of us tries to add a piece of an additional complexity. Of course, Mark, you are right. We will not resist this tide in Europe of extreme right and extreme left just by reviving the old Republican dream of our fathers and grandfathers, for sure. That's the reason why, as for myself, I am a devoted European. It is clear for me that the agora, the new public square, the new public space in which most of the questions we are discussing today, and most of the questions which, alas, we will not have the time to discuss, will be less and less the national, Republican, traditional space, and more the to-be-built European space, which is for the moment completely hopeless, terribly bureaucratic, absurd, Musilian, Robert Musil style, but the task of our generations is probably to build it. And this is the real reply which we can bring to the inheritors of Barès, time of Dreyfus affair, Maurras, the 30s, and this bunch of illiterate, stupid extreme leftists and extreme rightists who are taking the stage in these last years on the two banks of the Atlantic Lake.
Yeah, no, but totally, if I can add one word, I absolutely agree with what you just said about, first of all, the American press. They don't understand the country they live in. It's the real issue today. And it's the same way they don't understand France, they don't get what's going on in the US right now. They're blind to what's going on in the left, especially. And yes, Tablet is one of the places of resistance to that blindness today in the US. It's not the only one, fortunately enough. But about what you said also about Europe, it seems to me that it's one of the, and also about what Karen said before about universalism. It's the real task, right? What is universalism today? How do we define universalism in a global age? What's the difference between being universal, cosmopolitanists, if the word applies, and being global? It's not obvious to me. How do you make the difference? How do you fight the alienation of globalism with universalism?
This is the point. This is exactly the point.
Yeah, and it's very difficult.
Of course, but this should be the topic of a next tablet agency platform.
Absolutely.
With the same, yes, hopefully.
With pleasure.
Good point.
Thank you. I'd like to now turn it back to Simone for some closing remarks, but first let me apologize to the many viewers whose questions we won't have time to get to today. Simone?
Yes, I'll make it also very, very short. I would like to thank our panelists really for this fascinating conversation. As you can see, the situation in France couldn't be more complex, but also more fascinating. I was struck by the optimism of this group, which I didn't expect, I have to say, knowing you all so well. But it's a breath of fresh air. AJC, of course, has been and continues to be committed to fighting all forms of extremism, and we are not blind on any eye. And I think that's the most important thing. And I think that's why what we share with Tablet, and that's why we decided to cooperate here. So once again, thank you so much. Bernard, I will keep in mind that the next debate, the topic of the next debate, so we'll make sure that this will happen. Thank you so much for everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Simone. And thank you to our esteemed guests for today's incredible conversation. And thank you to our global audience for tuning in. Don't miss the next program of our series on December 7th, titled Did German History End with the Holocaust? Register for this program and more at ajc.org/advocacy anywhere. Thank you all again, and goodbye.